on any Sabbath. And on top of that, we have 20 different languages that are spoken in our churches every single Sabbath. And we belong to the South Pacific Division, where last year there were 49,000 baptisms. And what makes this division so interesting is that in countries like Papua New Guinea, there is one Seventh-day Adventist for every 11 people, and the prime minister is a Seventh-day Adventist. In the country of the Solomons, there's one Seventh-day Adventist for every 7 people. And it goes on and on like that until you come to Australia and New Zealand, where it's one Seventh-day Adventist for every 430 people, and shows very clearly the secularism that we have in this country and the challenge that we have of sharing the good news. So of the 49,000 people that were baptized last year in the South Pacific Division, only 700 were actually baptized in Australia. Of course, COVID played a major part in slowing that down, but normally we only have about 1,300 people who are baptized in this vast country with its wealth and with its abilities. And it's one of the biggest challenges that we have as a nation is how to deal with the giant in the land of secularism and how it's changing the nature of conversation in this country. I can tell you a whole bunch of different stories before I get into my sermon, but I want to just kind of tell you one story from what is happening good in our conference. That story is from the Little Ryde Church. Ryde is in the northern part of the city of Sydney. It's a little church that had 15 members a few years ago, 3 years ago to be exact, when a bunch of young adults from university decided that they would want to join the church. And so they did. And the church doubled in size and came up to about 50 members. And they were trying to figure out what to do to actually share the gospel in their community. The struggle that they had was that they did not have a lot of money and they weren't sure what the community needed until they found that the South Pacific Division had been producing a program called Mums at the Table, Mothers at the Table. And that program has on a weekly basis over 10,000 people, all women, all mothers, who are engaged with discussing issues that are relevant to them. Very few of those 10,000 women are actually Seventh-day Adventist. And so the South Pacific Division has been trying to figure out how to actually connect these 10,000 women to local churches. And the Ryde Church decided that they would actually start a home group in the church where they would invite the mothers from Mums at the Table program to come and share with one another, to meet physically. They had 30 non-Adventists who started showing up on a weekly basis. And as the church thought about it, they said, well, how do we connect them to our worship services? And they decided that they would make once a month a very special Sabbath school class that would be comfortable for these women and their families to attend. And once a month, over the last few months, they have been doing this special Sabbath school class, and all of the women with their children and with their husbands have been attending the church. And as a result, several of them have started Bible studies to be baptized because it comes through the connection and the communion that we actually have. It was interesting that when we were in Sabbath school class today, that I heard Maxwell make a statement that I thought was very, very good. Maxwell said, when we were growing up, we were often told that we could not mix with people who did not believe the same way that we believe. And that has caused great divisions. And it's true, for some reason, we thought that we were actually spiritual people if we remained isolated from the rest of the world. And in essence, we became like the Jews of old, where they had the purity and they did not want to have any kind of impurity come in. I'm very thankful that that is changing in our church and that we're starting to realize what opportunities we have lost as a result of this particular practice, because it's not part of our theology, it is part of our practice. And it's good to see churches like the Ryde Seventh-day Adventist Church in Sydney changing their perspective and becoming more dynamic because They're willing to actually engage in the real world where people are having big questions about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And they're making inroads that I think are wonderful. In line with that, the sermon that I'm going to share with you today is an odd one. And I understand that Pastor Darrell actually preached a sermon on this text 2 weeks ago. So I'm hoping that what I'm going to share is going to be completely different from what Darrell shares. And I can tell you that in terms of reading this particular passage, most of us read it very quickly and we pass it to the side, and we don't take the time to really consider the characters of the story. And I'm hoping that as you read it again, that some of what I have learned will be shared in a way that is brand new to you. So let me just share my screen, and you will then see where we're at. Let's see that. Can everybody see that? Fantastic. Okay, come with me to Genesis chapter 38. And when we come to Genesis chapter 38, the first thing that we note is that Genesis 38 is right in the middle of Genesis chapter 37, which is about the story of Joseph and his dreams, and Genesis chapter 39, which is about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And right in the middle of these two chapters is this chapter about Judah and Tamar. And it's not a tame story. It's actually quite a visceral, visual story. But when we look at this visual story, we often pass by it very quickly because we don't feel comfortable talking about what Scripture is trying to teach us. And I want to just give you some clarity on this by telling you that there are a number of characters that are important to understand before we read the text so that you can understand the text better. First of all, we have Judah. Judah is the fourth son of Leah and, of course, of Jacob. And Leah's name, her name means haggard, old, leathery cow, and therefore she's not a very pretty woman. And in the Canaanite language, that name is actually quite descriptive, as you can see. She has sons. Those sons are definitely give her value, but Jacob never really loves her to begin with. He loves Rachel. And over time only does he recognize how much Leah brings into his life. Her fourth son is Judah, and Judah's name means God be praised. I want you to think about that every time that you see Judah's name in the biblical text that we're going to be looking at. Secondly, there's a friend. There's a friend of our main character, Judah, and the friend is a Canaanite. He has no connection with the understanding of the one true God. He doesn't understand the character of God. His name actually means liberty or anger. And in some ways, when you think about his name, it's possible that Judah actually felt liberated as he left his father's home and met with the people of the land of Canaan, and in some way probably changed some of his learned behavior from home and probably made some poor decisions as a result. Hira comes from the town of Adullam, and Adullam in the text here in Genesis chapter 38 is a royal city of the Canaanites. So it's a pagan city, but it's a royal city. That's where the king actually lives, and Hira is a member of that community. The Bible actually tells us in Genesis chapter 38 that Judah falls in love with a Canaanite. She is not a member of his family. She's not a member of God's people. She's a member of the pagan Canaanites, and we are never given her name. Her name is just the daughter of Shua. In fact, we're told her name in three different places, twice here in the book of Genesis, chapter 38, and once in First Chronicles, chapter 2 and verse 3. Never given her name. And the reason that we're never given her name is that women in that time period, their value was only based on their sons, not on who they were as individuals. It's very rare that we actually get the names of women, and it is actually a very strong point that in Scripture women are listed fairly regularly because God always saw them as equal to men. Adam and Eve, for example. And so when we see daughter of Shua being spoken of here, we have to recognize that we're going back to a culture where a woman's value was not in her name, but was in her bride price and was in terms of how many boys she could actually produce. Then we have Tamar or Tamar. And Tamar, her name in the Canaanite language means source of life. It's a very interesting name because Tamar is again a central character in this story. And to understand in the mind frame of the narrator of Moses as he's writing this, is that there is a point that he wants to make sure that you get, in that Tamar is really important to the understanding of who Jesus becomes later on. So Tamar means source of life. The daughter of Shua has 3 sons. The first son's name is Now, I don't know how it is in French, but in English, we all have children, and some of our children are begat in error. And this is very close to the name that has, because his name, when it's inversed, is from the Hebrew word re, and that word means evil. It means somebody who has come to the end because of his bad behavior. And it's fascinating, as you'll see, that this becomes the truth for his life. Then there's the second son. The middle son's name is Onan, and his name means virile one. And we're talking here about virility in his ability to actually produce sons. Okay, so that's as clear as I can be without becoming a little bit rude. And then there's the third son, whose name is Sheila. Now, in Australia, anytime that you call somebody a Sheila, you're actually calling them a woman, which can be, back in the day, a bit of a negative. But here, the word Sheila is actually means to extract, to take out. And in the case of this story, it is connected with the daughter of Shua in that she extracted the last baby, and she ceases to have children, and that's the end of that. Okay, are we clear on all of those? I'll leave that up because we now need to go to the Bible text and read what Scripture says. Genesis chapter 38 and verse 1. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Abdullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua, and he married her, and he lay with her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan, and she gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Kezib that she gave birth to him and ceased her labor. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar or Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death. Now, let me just stop there and say, this is really quite a shocking statement, isn't it? That God actually causes somebody to come to his end. And when you look at the rabbis who have commented on this particular text over the centuries in the Mishnah and other rabbinic sources, they say that the reason that God actually brought life to an untimely close was because was doing things that were inappropriate when it came to his relationship with his wife. And we're not sure exactly what it means, but in the context of the Hebrew of this text, there seems to be an emphasis on being an individual who was physically or emotionally abusive of Tamar. And in that physical abuse, in that emotional abuse, he was giving a picture of God's character that was not in keeping with God's merciful character. And as a result, the people of the land of Canaan, and in particular, the capital city of Adullam, the royal city, was talking about the God of the Israelis in a way that was negative, in a way that was a pejorative, in a way that was blowing up any opportunity for Judah and for his father and brothers to be able to share the good news of why they should follow this new God. And so the Bible tells us that God puts to death. And it's very, very strange. Very rarely do we actually see this occur in such a personal manner. So dies. And then the Bible goes on to give us some very interesting consideration. The Bible says in verse 8, then Judah, God be praised, said to Onan, the virile one, I want you to sleep with your brother's wife, source of life, and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death as well. I want to ask you a question. Those of you who are married, women who are married, I can't see you at the moment, but I just want you to reflect on this. Those women who are married, if your husband died, would you be interested in marrying your husband's brother? I'm looking at my mother, and my mother has her husband, Pastor Eddie Johnson. He had two brothers, one who has passed on, and Uncle Carl, who is a doctor in France. And if dad died, according to this particular tradition, there was this sense that mom, if she didn't have a son at the time, would have to marry Uncle Carl. Or I guess it would be Uncle Alan, wouldn't it, Mom? Woo, that would be kind of fun to actually take a think, consider that. I don't know of a single woman, when I have actually shared this, who has put up their hand and said, yes, please, I'd much rather marry the brother now that I know who my husband truly is. It doesn't happen that way. But the reason that we have this is that it was actually a way of surviving, a way of providing care, social security, if you will, for women. So if you come with me to Deuteronomy chapter 25, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 to 6, I want to show you what the Old Testament actually says that kind of gives us an understanding of the fact that women had rights. Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and the first son that she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. That's a very interesting thing, because what it is indicating is that women had rights. They had rights that once they were married, that there was supposed to be a male, a boy born who would take care of them for the rest of their lives if their husbands died early. And quite often their husbands would die early because their husbands were 15 to 20 years older than the women that they married. And so they would die at a much younger age, and therefore the woman would be left bereft, penniless, with no person to guard her and to provide her with any kind of nourishment if she did not have a son. And so the way that that particular world tried to work it through is to actually put in place rules like we have here in Deuteronomy chapter 25 that said that if the brother died and there was no son, the woman had to be married within the family to the next son in order to be able to provide her with a long life of well-being. So the Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 38 that Judah, God be praised, does that. He gives her to Onan, but Onan knew that if he was to provide a son to source of life, Tamar, that the son would not carry his name, and that the son would carry the name of his brother. And if he carried the name of his brother, the inheritance of the family would be divided not to Onan, but to And so because of his selfish nature, and because of the fact that being the middle child, he had always wanted to be the oldest, but had not been able to do it, now has an opportunity to thwart the plan of Social Security for Tamar. More than happy to take her to his bed, but certainly not interested in providing for her as he was supposed to. And again, it brings the character of God into disrepute. Where is the integrity? Where is the compassion? Where is the empathy? Where is the understanding that there is a need to show grace, mercy, and to allow women to be given the opportunities that is theirs by right? So when Onan does this terrible deed, many times, not just once, the Lord takes his life because the people of Canaan were learning again about the character of God through people who were not showing that character in any way that was a blessing to the kingdom of heaven. So we come to this situation. Come back with me to Genesis chapter 38 and verse 11. As we come to that particular passage, the Bible tells us that God be praised, says to Source of Life, I want you to go back to be with your father for a little while because my son Sheila is not old enough to be married to you yet. And because he's not old enough, I will call you when the day comes and we will bring you together so that you can be provided for. But when we read this text, we don't think too much about it, except for in that culture and at that time, if a woman had to go back to the home of her father, she was not going to be going back with any kind of victory. She would be going back in shame. She would have brought her family's name into disrepute because she had not been able to provide any male heirs. And so when she was going back to her family was not going to treat her like she was part of the immediate family. They would start treating her like a servant. She was not going to live in the house. She was going to live in the servants' quarters. She was not going to be having any of the luxuries that would normally come to a woman in a married state. And because she had lost two husbands, she would be considered cursed. Nobody would want to come near her. There was no opportunity for her to get remarried to anybody else because the law of the land said you had to marry within the family that you had married to, and she was stuck in limbo. There was no room for her to have her rights being taken care of. And so in verse 11, the Bible says, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house until my son Sheila grows up, for he thought, my son may die too, just like his brothers. And so Tamar went to live in her father's house. And after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah. And here is a picture of Timnah. Timnah is a very interesting place because it's where the sheep were taken care of in the area where Judah was living. And you have to remember that Judah had left his father's house and had moved north and west from where his father lived, and he had established his own flocks. And his flocks had grown, and he had become a wealthy man, and he would have to send them away from his home in order to find new and fresh green grass. And as he would send them away from his home, he lived somewhere near Chezib there. His father lived somewhere near Hebron. And he would have to go through the little town of Enaim to get to Timnah. And Enaim is a fascinating town. Most towns in the time of Judah would have been between 100 and 150 people who were living together. They would be inside a walled environment. There would be a gate at the front of the town. And as you walked by the town, if you had business in the town, you would then go in to the town to have business. But immediately as you walked into the town, the elders of the town would stop you. They would vet you. They would check to see whether or not you should be allowed to actually be in their town. And if your business was acceptable, then they would allow you to do business in the town square, right where the elders were, because that's where all the businesses of town were. Now, there were no women who were allowed to be in that area. If you were a young unmarried woman, you could be a shepherdess and you could be working in the stalls. You could be helping your father or your brothers as they were doing business. But the moment that you became a married woman, you actually had to go and live in your husband's home and take care of the necessities of what that home needed. And so there were only a particular type of woman that would actually be allowed to work at the city gates. And the one person or the one woman that was allowed to work at the city gates, or the several women, were prostitutes. But because everybody in town knew everybody else, there was one stipulation that was made for every woman who worked as a prostitute. That is that they had to wear a veil. They had to wear a mask. And the reason that they had to do that was if you live in a town of 150 people, you will know everybody. And so, in order to preserve the family name, if one of your daughters had to go and work as a prostitute, you would make them wear a veil so that their shame would not be brought onto your family. And because the shame wasn't brought onto your family, everybody could pretend that they didn't know who that woman was. And the hypocrisy of the community was such that everybody knew who was the prostitute, but nobody would say it out loud so that everybody's honor could be kept. Now, I want you to think about this. You have had COVID in Mauritius, and many of you have had to wear masks. But if you've known each other very, very well, and you walked down the street and you see a person with a mask, you will recognize them if they've been coming to church, regardless of if they're wearing a mask. And that's exactly the same with the veil. The veil goes on, but it's the eyes that we actually look at. And as we're looking at the eyes, we know if that person is somebody who is of our family. And so the name Enaim, which is here in the story, is interesting because Enaim is a name that means eyes. Let me see if I can move this forward here. In Hebrew, it means eyes. So there's this concept that Enaim is eyes that are penetrating and looking, but more than eyes that are penetrating and looking, they're eyes of judgment. So Judah, God be praised, walks towards Timnah, and he bypasses the little town of the eyes of judgment. And those eyes of judgment are interesting because we are told that when Tamar, in verse 13 of Genesis chapter 38, was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothing, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Tamar covers everything except for her eyes of judgment. And she sits at the city gate of the town of the eyes of judgment. Now, I want to ask you a question. Remember that Judah's name means God be praised. How did Tamar know that if she dressed as a prostitute, Judah would stop by? Is it possible that Judah's regular stops on his way to shearing his sheep was to use the services of a prostitute in a town on the road? And it had become such public knowledge that when Tamar found out, source of life finds out, that God be praised is on his way to taking care of the sheep, she knows that she can make herself into a prostitute and stop him. Come with me back to Genesis chapter 38, verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, because it had been several years since he had seen her. And remember that women didn't have a lot of value. They just had to produce children. So we probably don't have a lot of facial recognition. He went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. Clearly, he has done this before. He's quite confident to be able to go right up to the road and say, hey, this is a good time. Would you allow me to sleep with you? Interesting, isn't it? I want to take you back to Genesis chapter 27, because before we go to this last section of our sermon, you need to have fully in your mind the rights that Tamar and women had who had lost their husband. And this is what Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 7 says. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she will go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill his duty. And then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him, and in the presence of the elders, she'll take off one of his sandals, she'll spit in his face and say, this is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled ones. We look at this Bible verse and we think, what exactly is this all about? It certainly does not sound that terrible or that tragic. But in the cultural sense, this was a death knell. This was a condemnation of a man and his family that would mean the end of his lineage. Because you see, the culture itself has symbols, and those symbols are actually here in this story. The shoe, and I've got to be careful again because we have children here, so I don't want to offend anybody. So I'll try and do this as broadly as I can. The shoe represents the female reproductive organ. The foot represents the male reproductive organ. And so as the woman goes and takes the shoe off the foot of the male, she is saying to that man and to all of the men who are sitting around the table or around the center of the square, this man is not man enough to do his job. And then she spits in his face. And you can imagine what the spit represents as well. So she was saying, you cannot produce an heir. And that's the reason that they're known as the family of the unsandaled ones. Forever. If that happened to your family, the dishonor was so overwhelming that your sons would never be allowed to marry any other daughter in the village or in the community. In essence, your lineage would come to an end. That was the right of source of life. Now come back with me to Genesis chapter 38 as we bring this story to a conclusion. When we come to Genesis chapter 38, we're told that Tamar wants to negotiate with source of life. With God be praised. So God be praised says to her, what's it going to cost for me to sleep with you? And she says, what do you have? And he says, I'll give you a kid. I'll give you a goat. I'll give you a goat, but not a mature goat, a young goat. And she says, well, you don't have this goat with you. How do I know that you're actually going to give me this goat? And he says, well, what do you want? And she is smart. She says to him, I want the objects that you see on the screen. I want your staff. I want the rock or the hardened clay signet. And I want the cord that the signet is on. And this was very important because the staff that a man carried was often heavily engraved. It had carvings on it. But what was most important about that staff is that the carvings were usually the name of the man, the name of his father, the name of his grandfather, the name of his great-great-grandfather. In essence, it was his passport. It was his identity card. And believe it or not, I still have my Mauritian passport. And it means that if I ever want to go to Mauritius, they probably will not accept it because it doesn't look like me. But the potential is that I can actually come and say, here is who I am. These are who my parents are. It was like his passport. And then that little clay, hardened clay, was used around the neck often on a cord, was used to imprint on soft clay the name of the family like a credit card receipt. And so is a credit card receipt, this meant that source of life took from God be praised his passport and his credit card, and now she had some identification. I think this is brilliant. And I think that as Moses is writing this, he must have been laughing as he's putting this story together, going, Lord, have mercy. How in the world did this all come about? I mean, this is better than any soap opera that you actually get to see on television. You can't make these kinds of stories up. But God wants you to know about these stories because it's clear that he wants us to understand the type of people that have come before us and where we fit in that whole process as well. So the Bible tells us that Judah said, okay, that sounds like an idea. And he goes in and he sleeps with her. And the irony of ironies is that having slept with his wife for months, never gets her pregnant. Onan, having slept with Tamar for months, never gets her pregnant. Judah sleeps with her for the cost of a small goat, and he gets her pregnant in the first night, and she goes away. And the Bible tells us right away, the very next day, Judah sends his friend to find the prostitute, to pay the prostitution price, and he can't find her. Well, this becomes a problem. He doesn't want to lose face. He's a little bit concerned that shame is going to come on his name. Not that he slept with a prostitute. That's not where the shame comes. The shame for him is, I didn't pay, that somebody will know that I didn't pay. And of course, the other shame is, somebody has got my credit card and my driver's license. Now, I think I'd be a little bit nervous if I had done this. I think I'd be worried that Elder Sinyen, when he brings the church board together to find out about who got pregnant with whom, and the woman says, this is the man, and the man says, no, it wasn't me, until he is shown his credit card and his driver's license. I think at that point in time, the board meeting is over. It's finished. And it's exactly this that occurs in Genesis chapter 38. Verse 24, come with me there. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar, source of life, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she's now pregnant. And Judah, without any sense of hypocrisy, says, whoa, bring her out and have her burned to the death. Now, he is perfectly happy using a prostitute whenever he feels like it's necessary, but if it is his daughter-in-law, she has to be put to death. And she, I tell you, I think she must have had quite a day as a Canaanite pagan woman, sending this to the high and mighty man of God, this little message. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, which said, dear father, I am pregnant by the man who owns this driver's license and this credit card. See if you recognize whose seal, cord, and staff these are. I mean, I think the sarcasm comes out, right? See if you recognize this. I'm not too sure if you remember. It's been only 3 months. 12 weeks is a long time. Are you sure that you recognize these things? And the Bible actually tells us that Judah was righteous. Now, I want you to just stop there and think about this. Those 3 items were unique to Judah, and it was those 3 things that she had to prove that Judah was the father of the child, and therefore to prove that she had not committed adultery, but in fact she had conducted herself through the rules of the Levirate marriage. She was actually more righteous in the way that she had done it. She had the right to bring him into the meeting of the elders, to take the shoe off, to damn his family forever. And the lineage of his family would have come to a screeching halt. But this Canaanite woman had more grace and had more mercy than Judah had, and she chose to do the more graceful thing by actually forcing the hand of Judah, by pretending to be a prostitute, and therefore getting pregnant from her father-in-law. Now, throughout the ages, men have spoken very poorly about Tamar. They have called her the prostitute. They have said that she manipulated Judah. They've said because Judah was sad after the loss of his wife, it was only that reason that he actually went to see a prostitute. But clearly you can see today that that is not the case, that he had done it on a regular basis, and that this was part of his practice. And clearly you can see that she was the one who was manipulated. She was the one whose rights had been taken away, where fairness and integrity had been gone, where the character of God, which was supposed to have been shown to her through through Onan, through Judah, through Shelah, all supposed men of God, God be praised, had not come through the way that it was supposed to be. And when she had the opportunity to bring them into justice and ruin their family forever, she chose instead to be more gracious, more compassionate, more caring and empathic than they had been to her. So it's in that context that we come to the passage that was read at the very beginning of the worship service. And she is pregnant, and the Bible tells us that in her pregnancy, she doesn't just have one son, she ends up with 2 sons. The Lord blessed her and blessed her beyond her belief and showed her mercy that had not been shown to her. But it's this statement here that I find fascinating before I finish and bring you to Matthew chapter 1. This is interesting in terms of irony. It's interesting that Judah wants to give a goat to Tamar to pay for his night of passion. And it is the same Judah who tried to deceive his father with a coat dipped in the blood of a kid goat only a few months earlier. But where he had deceived his father, he himself was the one that was deceived this time. Just an interesting side note to this amazing story. She is more righteous than I, since I would not give her to my son Shelah, and Tamar does not suffer the consequences of a woman caught in prostitution. So what does God think about all of this? Come with me to Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1, 2, and 3. And I want to show you an interesting understanding that Matthew had. Now remember, Matthew is a Jew, and Matthew is speaking to the Jewish people, and so he wants to make sure that they recognize that Jesus truly was who he said he was, and that he had all of the genealogy to support his claim, right? And so in verse 1 we see, this is a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, who was the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of, God be praised, and his brothers. And God be praised was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, source of life. And I want to just end on this. We have a Canaanite woman whose name means source of life, who ultimately Matthew lists as the source of life for two boys who are part of the genealogy of Jesus. We know that God was miraculous in the way in which he did this, and he didn't need to actually have those names put in to Matthew chapter 1, but Matthew deliberately puts it in here because of the value of the name of Tamar, a pagan Canaanite woman who had married one of the first followers of God. And in that relationship, she becomes, in essence, the source of life for you and I, not because of her sacrifice, but in terms of the genealogy. And it shows that God has a special place for people who are vulnerable, for people who have been maligned, for people who have been taken advantage of, for people who should have expected integrity and character, but instead were deceived and used and abused. And this woman, who had been used, who had been abused by people who were supposed to be sharing the character of God, ultimately becomes the source of life for you and me. And I end with this statement to you. Who are you going to be the source of life for? If she became the source of life for her two sons, who ultimately were in the genealogy of Jesus, who is God asking you to be the source of life for? Is it your friend? Is it your neighbor? Is it your family member? Is the way that you're actually characterizing the name of God being done in such a beautiful manner that he is lifted up and therefore is drawing all mankind to him? Or is it being so maligned that your friend and neighbor never want to come to hear about the one true God? It's the challenge that each one of us has. And as we close today by singing our hymn, I want you to reflect on that and realize that God is asking you to be a source of life by sharing who he is. Amen.
En réponse à cet appel de notre témoignage personnel, comprenons que notre seul rempart, c'est Jésus. Et je vous invite donc à chanter, pour terminer notre service, le cantique au numéro 328. Je me tiendrai tout près du Maître, plus près jour après jour. Et voilà. Et